I want to tell you about what happened one summer evening. During a violent thunderstorm, a mother was tucking her small boy into bed. She was about to turn off the light when he asked with a tremor in his voice, "Mommy, will you sleep with me tonight?" The mother smiled and gave him a reassuring hug. "I can't, dear," she said. "I have to sleep in Daddy's room." A long silence was broken at last by a shaky little voice. "The big sissy," right? The big sissy. A man had been visiting a therapist because he had a fear of monsters underneath his bed. The man had been seeing a doctor or therapist for months and months to no avail. Every time he would come, the doctor would say, "Have you made any progress?" And every time the man would say no. He couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't sleep. These monsters under his bed were driving him crazy. Finally, he sought out another therapist. He returned back to his old therapist to check in. "Have you made any progress now?" "Yes, I'm feeling better," says the man. The doctor said, "What happened?" The man said, "I went to another doctor and he cured me in one session." "One session? What did he do? How did he cure you?" "He told me to cut the legs off of my bed." Right? Okay, it doesn't have to be funny. I'm a rabbi. But it does take us into what I want to talk about. Monsters underneath our bed and fear when the thunderstorms and the darkness come rolling in. Because the truth is, we are a lot like that man on the bed who fears the monsters underneath, or the child who fears the boogeyman in the closet, right? All of us, especially as children, have fears that monsters are real. I mean, there isn't a parent here who hasn't gone through a ritual that I go through every night with my girls. They're not here. We go through their room, and first I have to shut the closets. And not only is it you got to shut the closet, you got to turn the light on in a shut closet. You got to go out to the bathroom and shut the door, right? All these rituals. Why? To check under the bed to make sure that the monsters aren't there, that the boogeyman isn't there. And then we grow up. And we realize, or we start to believe, that monsters aren't real, not something you have to keep at bay. You don't have to look underneath your bed. It's silly. It's childish, right? We're too sophisticated for that. Monsters aren't real, or so we believe. But the truth of the matter is, kids know what they're talking about. It's not coincidental that we all intuited that there are monsters. Maybe not underneath the bed, and boogeymen maybe not in the closet. But make no mistake about it, this childish fantasy is not just a fantasy, it's true. As we grow older, right, the monsters change, and they morph, and they lurk in different types of shadows, and they come out in different types of ways, but they are destructive, more destructive than those monsters underneath the bed. The only difference is that they take up a new residence, but that's the only difference. This time the residence is in our minds and in our hearts and in our souls. Or in the words of the famous monster author Stephen King, monsters are real, they live inside of us, and sometimes they win. So a couple weeks ago, a famous monster author, Maurice Sendak, died. What did he write? Anybody know? Where the Wild Things Are. As a kind of a coincidence, a synchronicity, and this is another talk for another time, I found out he died on May 8th in Danbury, Connecticut. I'd never been to Danbury, Connecticut, except on May 8th. When my son and I stopped over on our way to upstate New York, we slept in Danbury, Connecticut on May 8th, the day that in the place that Maurice Sendak died. Again, another talk for another time, but it reaffirmed the importance of me learning about this great man. I had no idea. I mean, I heard the story, Where the Wild Things Were. It was one of my favorite books, as it was many of you. Came out in the 60s. Many of us grew up on that book. And it was a profound breakthrough. I had no idea. At the time, it was revolutionary. And it was also very controversial. Why? Because as you know from Where the Wild Things Are, Sendak painted a portrayal of youth very different than the pastel colors and the fluffy Big Bird type monsters, though he was much later. But we weren't presented that type of a monster growing up. We were presented a light and an airy and a fluffy monster, but that wasn't the monsters of Where the Wild Things Are. Sendak came along and he said basically this, that childhood isn't just innocent. There's cruelty in childhood. There are demons in childhood. There are monsters that live underneath our bed. But the real point of Where the Wild Things Are, who's the ultimate monster in the book? Not the monsters that hanging from the trees. It was Max, the monster, the boy. The monsters were within him. He was the king of the wild things, according to Sendak. It was a very important breakthrough to start to look at our monsters and talk about our monsters and be honest that every single one of us, even children, have monsters more than just in the closet, monsters within. Monsters are real, right? They live inside of us and sometimes they win. And that's what this week's Torah portion, in my opinion, is about. It's not theology. If it is, it's bad theology. I couldn't say it any better than Alexis, who said, if you do God's will and God's commandments and you live a good life, then you're supposed to get good things that happen to you. And if you do bad things and you don't live God's will and you don't do commandments, then bad things happen. But what about, as Alexis pointed out, theodicy? Theodicy boiled down to a simple phrase: why do bad things happen to good people? Or the converse of that, why do good things happen to bad people? We know too many examples of both to prove this Torah portion wrong. But it's not just about theology. We read the Torah for psychology. This is a great psychological document. And this, it does make sense. There are two ways to look at life. Either we face our monsters and we deal with our monsters, or we let them hide underneath the bed. Right? So the first case, dealing with our monsters. What do we have in this week's Torah portion? God gives us instruction, commandments, right? Do good things, be upright, be honest, be kind, be decent, be truthful. And he says, "Im b'hukkotai telchu, ved mitzvotai tishma'u v'asitem otam." And if you do all these things, if you follow my commandments, if you live this way, what does God say? "V'natati shalom ba'eretz ushachtem ve'ein machridi." V'hishbati chaya ra min haaretz v'cherev lo ta'avor ba'artzechem. If you do this, what does it literally say? I will grant you peace, and there will not be chaya ra. There will not be wild things in your life or underneath your bed or in your heart. If you live a good life, I'll remove the wild things from the land, from your closet, and from your mind and your heart and your soul. Or as the rabbis say, mitzvah goreret mitzvah. Doing one good thing leads to another good thing, leads to a life filled with goodness and decency, regardless of what happens on the outside of us. When you live a life of integrity and courage and fearlessness, that is the reward. And that's how we minimize the monsters underneath our bed or in our head. You want a good sleep at night? You want a life of peace, a life free from the wild things? Then learn to live in a way that is truthful and good and decent and honest, and you will live without the wild things. But we're human, and that's not what we do, at least not what we do all of the time. So there's another part of the Torah portion, and that is about not living out goodness and truth and integrity. And what happens then when we hurt and we lie and we cheat and we steal and we betray and we fall short and we fail? V'im lo tishma'u v'lo ta'asu et kol hamitzvot ha'ela. If you don't listen to me and you don't live this kind of a life, v'hishlachti b'chem et chayas sadeh, then I will send upon you wild things. I will send upon wild things, not into your external life. Bad things happen to good people. It isn't just God's doing, right? It's chaotic at times, and it isn't always God punishing us. But what happens when we live a life of lies, when we hurt other people? God sends into our lives fearfulness, and that breeds more fearfulness and more fearfulness. Avera goreret avera. Right? The rabbi says the second part of that equation, that doing bad things causes more bad things. Breeding more darkness causes more darkness. Living a life where you continually feel the monsters growing within you and you don't deal with it, what's the punishment? Causing more monsters in our life. And so the rabbis say, live a life where you minimize the monsters and you maximize the truth, and that's how you get them out of your head, and that's how you get them out from underneath your bed. I don't know if there's a hell, and I don't know if there's a heaven. I hope to find out the latter, not for many years from now. But I do know this, and many of you have experienced this as well. There is hell on earth. What is hell on earth? When you live a life driven by those monsters, terrified by those monsters, what does God say? that you will find no peace, that you will flee even when nobody is pursuing you, that anxiety, that doubt, that fear will rule your life. That is hell on earth. There is no greater hell than living in a perpetual state of anxiety and doubt and fear. But the converse is true. There is a heaven on earth. What is heaven on earth? When we deal with those shadows, when we go into the darkness, when we talk about the monsters, we minimize those monsters. We live a life of truth and integrity and decency, which is exactly what Sendak wanted to get us to look at and to talk about. And yes, even with our children. It isn't coincidental that this was written about 20 years after the Holocaust. Why? Because Maurice Sendak was a Jew, and Maurice Sendak was a survivor. His parents escaped Poland during the war, and they had experienced many of the terrors of the Holocaust. Can you imagine? I know some of you know firsthand what it's like to either have faced those horrors or to have been children of people who faced those horrors, the unspoken monsters that lived in the lives of families. Sendak was a brave, courageous man who said, let's talk about those monsters, let's face those monsters, because he understood that there are monsters in the world. There are monsters in the world. Hitler was a monster. Ahmadinejad is a monster. There is evil in the world. But for most of us, day in, day out, those aren't the monsters that rule our lives. What are the monsters that rule our lives? This inner monster of anxiety and doubt and fear. And he came along and said, let's give it voice. Let's talk about it. Buckminster Fuller was once asked to name the most important figure of the 20th century. And he said, without a shadow of a doubt, who was it? Sigmund Freud. Why? Why wasn't it Einstein? Why wasn't another physicist or elected official, somebody who brought peace? Why was it Sigmund Freud? And he said, because Sigmund Freud reminded us of the most important truth in this lifetime, that the invisible is more important than the visible. And this is the thesis of Judaism, that the invisible is more important than the visible. No matter what is happening outside of us that is bad, that is visible, it doesn't compare to what's happening on the inside of us. We cannot control our external circumstances, but we can always control our internal response. The invisible is more important than the visible. This is the message of B'hukkotai. This is the message of where the wild things are. This is the message of Judaism. This is the message of life, to deal with the invisible monsters of addictions and jealousy and anger and greed and deceit and lies, and especially, above all else, the monster of fear. So let me end with this, because Max, king of the wild things, gives up being a wild thing, finally deals with his wild things, his monsters. And it says, the king of all wild things said, I am lonely. I want to be where someone loves me best of all. I'll give up being king of the wild things, says Max. But the wild things cried, oh, please don't go. We'll eat you up. We love you so. And Max said no. The wild things roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. But Max stepped into his private boat and waved to the wild things goodbye. Our job, our purpose, our duty in this lifetime is to face our wild things, to be honest about our wild things, to find somebody to talk to about our wild things, the monsters within. And if we do, v'hishbati chayal ra min haaretz, God says, nothing will frighten you. No man, no woman, no external circumstance, no thing. You'll be able to face your monsters. You'll be able to look under your bed. You'll be able to get a good night's sleep, and you will one day know peace. My prayer is that Maurice Sendak rest in peace and that we all have a good night's sleep. Shabbat shalom.